Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Indeed, it is a pleasure and an honor to be afforded this opportunity to share with you all some thoughts and reflections on the epistemology of Abu Hamid al-Ghazālī, with particular focus on doubt, certainty, and the path to truth. Particularly also in anticipation for the upcoming course on al-Ghazālī's worldview. So inshallah, that will begin on the 23rd of June. So to begin, since we'll be speaking about doubt, without a doubt, al-Ghazālī is probably the most influential scholar in Islamic intellectual thought. And indeed, he is a paradigmatic personality. It is almost impossible to talk about Imam al-Ghazālī without, sorry, there's a message here. Okay, alhamdulillah. It's almost impossible to talk about Islamic intellectual thought with some reference to al-Ghazālī. When we look at the history of Islamic intellectual thought, it's always as pre and post al-Ghazālī. Whether it may, and he's had an indelible mark on kalam, on philosophy, on Sufism, on jurisprudence, on usul fiqh. And it's for that reason al-Ghazālī is considered hujjatul Islam, is considered proof, the proof of Islam. And it is almost unanimous that al-Ghazālī is considered as the mujaddid of his age, right? He's considered the reviver of his century. Like our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that every 100 years Allah will send forth from the community a mujaddid to revive the deen. And so al-Ghazālī is unanimously considered to be that mujaddid. So al-Ghazālī, he was a scholar with a critical spirit. He was someone who relentlessly struggled to pursue truth, to pursue certainty. He was no dogmatist or religious zealot. And he's someone that took from many different traditions and from many different disciplines. And something that really defines al-Ghazālī is that he is eclectic and he takes from various disciplines. And I think he really embodies the prophetic tradition with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, al-hikmah dalatul mu'min, that knowledge or wisdom is the lost property of the believer. So wherever he finds it, he takes it. And that was al-Ghazālī. He was someone that appropriated knowledge from any quarter that he could find it, wherever he could find truth. He appropriated it and he integrated it into the Islamic tradition. He was a synthesizer. And so that which he deemed to be universal and consistent with the Quranic worldview, he integrated that within his Sunni orthodoxy. And so my intention for the forthcoming course and for this webinar, I'm hoping to give a systematic overview of al-Ghazālī's epistemology. And so what is epistemology? Epistemology is it's a theory of knowledge. It is how do we know what we know? It is how do we determine what is truth and what is falsehood? Do we have the capacity for knowledge? It deals with discussions of the foundations of knowledge or foundationalism, or whether knowledge is possible, right? The subject of skepticism. And what are our sources of knowledge? And so epistemology is a branch of philosophy alongside cosmology, metaphysics, ontology, ethics, political philosophy. Epistemology is one branch of philosophy. And so al-Ghazālī, what really defines al-Ghazālī's epistemology is that his epistemology is holistic, right? There's no tension between reason and revelation. He's someone that bridged the esoteric and the exoteric. And neither is there a dichotomy between rationalism and empiricism. If you look at the history of Western philosophy, it's basically a history of the tension between empiricism and rationalism. And at least in my reading, how I see al-Ghazālī is, he didn't see rationalism and mysticism to be mutually exclusive, right? But they weren't antagonistic to one another, but they were complementary to one another, which is the primary focus of our discussion today. But because al-Ghazālī is such an eclectic scholar, he has written widely and has been so influential on the Islamic tradition, there's of course many myths, there are many misconceptions. Al-Ghazālī, he has been read in many different ways in contemporary scholarship and as well as in popular discourse. But even during al-Ghazālī's own time, right? Al-Ghazālī in 1106, there was the Nishapur controversy, and al-Ghazālī was accused of being a Zoroastrian. He was accused of being part of the Ikhwan al-Safa. He was accused of being an Abyssinian philosopher. And so even today, these perceptions continue, right? There's a lot of disagreement and a lot of misconceptions and myths, and we're hoping to deal with some of these questions and these issues in this webinar and the forthcoming course, inshallah. So al-Ghazālī, he was born in Tus, right? Khorasan, which is present-day Iran, northeast Iran. In the year, my brain doesn't work in Hijri, but he's born in 1058 and passes away in 1111. I think it's 450, yeah, 450 Hijri that he was born. And so that was during the period of Abbasid Seljuk rule. And so I'm hoping, inshallah, in the forthcoming course to give a more expansive treatment of the background to al-Ghazālī and the context of al-Ghazālī, the politics of his day, the history, the geography, and how this, of course, influenced his thought. But the main question, what is the path to certainty? That's the focus for today's discussion, and of course, al-Ghazālī skepticism. If we look at contemporary Ghazalian studies, when reading al-Ghazālī, there's difference of opinion. Some emphasize the rational, some emphasize the mystical. Some say al-Ghazālī was a philosopher, others say al-Ghazālī was a Sufi, right? They say al-Ghazālī was just this recluse Sufi personality. Others argue that al-Ghazālī was this philosopher of an Abyssinian bent. And so there's this debate, is al-Ghazālī a Sufi, is he a philosopher? Did he emphasize the rational or the mystical as a path towards certainty? And so if we look at the early 20th century in Ghazalian studies, particularly the mid-20th century, Montgomery Watt, he was an Orientalist scholar. He popularized this idea that al-Ghazālī was this, after his conversion or after his spiritual crisis, al-Ghazālī became this recluse Sufi, and he was anti-philosophy, and he was a vehement opponent or enemy of philosophy, because he wrote the Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, not philosophy, the incoherence of the philosophers. And so this sort of popularized this idea. But along with this idea came this notion that al-Ghazālī is the one to be blamed, and al-Ghazālī single-handedly offered the death blow to philosophy in the Muslim world, right? And post al-Ghazālī, everything was in decline, right? There was an intellectual decline of the al-Ghazālī. And because al-Ghazālī was critical of philosophy or the philosophers, and remember, science and mathematics, physics, and so on, science was a branch of philosophy. It's not like today, mathematics and science and so on is considered as separate or independent of philosophy. And so there's this assumption that al-Ghazālī was anti-science, al-Ghazālī was anti-causality, there's this popular scientist, Neil deGrasse Tyson, is a video that went viral where he's saying that al-Ghazālī was anti-knowledge, al-Ghazālī was anti-mathematics. And if you were to just read al-Ghazālī's Munqidh min al-Dalal, his deliverance from error, one would notice that al-Ghazālī, if you just do superficial reading, you'll see that al-Ghazālī was not anti-mathematics. But these ideas have been perpetuated, these ideas have been popularized. And then on the other hand, there was a revisionist trend, right? This revisionist trend took place towards the end of the 20th century. It began with the likes of Richard Frank, and he argues that al-Ghazālī is in actual fact an undercover philosopher, right, of the Abyssinian bent. He says that al-Ghazālī was not an Ash'ari, as we assume him to be, and that he has a higher theology. Other scholars, such as Binyamin Abrahamov, he argues that al-Ghazālī feigns his preference for mystical experience, right? And al-Ghazālī has an esoteric philosophy, is essentially an undercover philosopher, and to the awam, or to the masses, he puts on this garb of Sufism and so on. But in actual fact, he's not the orthodox Ash'ari scholar or Sufi, but he is this Abyssinian philosopher. Others argue that al-Ghazālī's tahafut al-falasifa, his incoherence of the philosophers, is a pseudo-refutation, right? It's not an actual refutation. In actual fact, al-Ghazālī believes in many of the ideas of the philosophers, such as the denial of the bodily resurrection. And so there are many of these ideas, and this was a necessary correction, right? The pendulum swung in the other direction. And there's been some contribution to the scholarship in the sense that we've begun to recognize that the influence of Ibn Sina and al-Farabi on al-Ghazālī. And al-Ghazālī wasn't anti-reason, he wasn't anti-science, he wasn't anti-causality. And we have a more balanced reading of al-Ghazālī. But even someone, and this isn't just in contemporary scholarship, if you look at Ibn Taymiyyah, the prominent jurist, he says that al-Ghazālī, he snuck logic or philosophy into the Islamic tradition, right? He was like a Trojan horse, he says. It was a Trojan horse of philosophy or Greek logic. And so Ibn Taymiyyah was critical of al-Ghazālī for that reason. And al-Ghazālī, he remains an enigma, and he will probably continue being an enigma for for a good few centuries. And I don't think I've had the last word on it, and I don't think any of our contemporary scholars have as well. But even someone like Ibn Rushd, he says al-Ghazālī is a philosopher with the philosophers, a Sufi with the Sufis, and an Ash'ari with the Ash'aris. So, however, so that's on certainty, right? And the best means towards certainty. Is it the rational or the mystical? Was al-Ghazālī a Sufi? Was he a philosophy? Was he a philosopher, right? And we cannot speak about certainty without speaking about doubt, right? Doubt and certainty, they are one side of they are both two parts of the same coin, right? And so al-Ghazālī, he is famous for his methodological doubt, because he anticipates René Descartes, who comes something like 400-500 years later. And if anyone had the opportunity to read René Descartes' discourse on method, and you've read al-Ghazālī's Munqidh min al-Dalal, you'd see there's amazing similarities between the two scholars in their methodological skepticism, right? And someone, what René Descartes was attempting to do, he was attempting to deconstruct his own epistemology. He was critical of everything. That was his methodological skepticism. He was critiquing his sense perception, his rational judgments. He wanted to establish his knowledge on sound foundations, right? And that's why we've come to know his famous maxim, I think, therefore I am, the 𝐁𝐜𝐚𝐿. And he's essentially establishing his existence on the basis of the fact that he thinks, right? So that becomes the epistemic plinth by which René Descartes establishes his philosophy. Although there's much commonality between Ghazali and René Descartes, I argue that al-Ghazālī is very much different to Descartes, right? And we're talking 4 or 5 centuries prior. I don't know if he was directly influenced by al-Ghazali. There's no evidence that Ghazali's 𝐁𝐚𝐥𝐚𝐿 was translated into Latin, but I think there were some Orientalist scholars that René Descartes perhaps maybe had some access to, and they were acquainted with al-Ghazali. But al-Ghazali's methodological doubt, what's important to note, al-Ghazali was no universal skeptic, right? He did consider knowledge to be possible. He was someone constantly seeking the truth, trying to seek certainty. He's not like the Greek skeptics. The Greek skeptics, they held that knowledge is not possible, that man does not have the capacity to know. Whereas for al-Ghazali, we know in his Ihya Ulumuddin, in the very first book, the Kitabul Ilm, the book of knowledge, he talks about the virtues of knowledge at length. And so al-Ghazali was someone, his methodological skepticism was aimed at establishing the foundations of knowledge. He wanted to establish the foundations of knowledge on the basis of certainty. And then his skepticism is also applied to heterodox doctrine. His skepticism was a type of critical inquiry towards attaining certainty, towards attaining truth, towards attaining true knowledge. And so in the 𝐁𝐚𝐿 min al-Dalal, al-Ghazali discusses his methodological doubt. And this is often called his epistemological crisis. But he begins with taqleed, uncritical imitation, right? He's critical of uncritical imitation. And he argues that that is not something you could rely on. He cannot rely on what has been taught to him by his teachers or from his community or from his forefathers, right? He has to come to conclusions on his own, on epistemic certainty, right? And so al-Ghazali is critical of blind following, of imitation, on taqleed, and we will discuss taqleed in more detail in the forthcoming course. Al-Ghazali, of course, wasn't a completely anti-authoritarian personality. He did recognize the place of a rational taqleed, but in general, al-Ghazali, he says that I couldn't rely on taqleed, I couldn't rely on the authority of others, right? He had to establish his knowledge on the basis of certainty. He had to have indubitable certainty of his knowledge. And so al-Ghazali, he says that, and then he moved from taqleed towards sense perception. He says, and then in the 𝐁𝐚𝐿 min al-Dalal, I wish I could have expand on some of these ideas in more detail. But al-Ghazali is critical of his sense perception. He came to realize that he cannot have any confidence in sense perception, right? He sees that the shadow is still, but upon investigation, he comes to realize that the shadow is actually moving. So he undermines sense perception. Then he moves on to rationalism, right? Or his rational judgments. He says, in the same way that the rational judge undermined my sense data, perhaps there's a higher level of knowing that would undermine my rational judgments. And the first principles that rational judgments are established on. So al-Ghazali begins to critique not just reason, but the very foundations of reason, right? Axiomatic truths, or that which we regard as necessary knowledge, al-ilm al-daruri, right? Propositions like 11 is more than 3, or one thing cannot be in 2 places at the same time, or that you cannot affirm and deny something at the same time. And so al-Ghazālī reaches the point where he speculates of a higher level of knowing, right? A trans-rational state, essentially, which would undermine the rational state, and eventually falls into this epistemic quandary, right? He finds himself at this intellectual impasse where he cannot affirm or deny anything, because he's undermined his sense perception, he's undermined reason and the first principles of reason. So you cannot even begin to form an argument. If you've undermined reason, you cannot establish any argument, you cannot affirm, you cannot deny anything. And he was at this impasse, right? He's taken his skepticism to its logical conclusions. And he says, this continued for a period of 2 months. For 2 months, I couldn't affirm or deny anything. I've undermined anything. And he says eventually, he found deliverance, right? He didn't find deliverance through reason, but he says at length, God Most High cured me of that sickness. My soul regained its health and equilibrium, and once again, I accepted the self-evident data of reason and relied on them with safety and certainty. But that was not achieved by constructing a proof or putting together an argument. On the contrary, it was the effect of a light which God Most High cast into my breast, and that light is the key to most knowledge. So al-Ghazālī arrives at this point where he says that he found deliverance, and that's where the name of the book comes from, Deliverance from Error. He found deliverance through a divine light, that Allah cast a light into his breast, and this eventually gave him confidence in his rational judgments and the first principles of reason and deduction. And so essentially what al-Ghazālī is establishing the foundations of knowledge, or is foundationalism. It is established on the basis of a divine light, on the basis of a trans-rational source. So it doesn't establish the foundations of knowledge on the basis of reason. No, it establishes the foundations of knowledge on the basis of a divine light, on the basis of a divine source. And that is what gives him confidence, or gives us confidence in our capacity to reason, in our confidence in first principles, and in our sense perception, right? This cup that's before me, I have confidence in my sense perception because God has placed it in my heart to have confidence in my sense perception and my faculties of reason and the first principles of knowledge. So al-Ghazālī establishes the foundations of knowledge from a logic from on high. And so it is also important to remember that al-Ghazālī was no doctrinal or theological skeptic, and he's very clear about this. He says that at no point did he deny the existence of God or prophecy or the last day. And so al-Ghazālī was a methodological skeptic, but he defines this as a malady. He says it was a sickness, right? It was he went through a period of safsata, right? Which is skepticism, right? So, so moving on from, so that's the foundations of knowledge, and inshallah in the forthcoming course, I'm hoping to discuss classical Greek skepticism, the metaphysical dimensions of knowledge itself, the nature of knowledge. We'll go into more detail into al-Ghazālī's methodological skepticism, but also his psychological and existential skepticism. And we'll talk about the existence of God as well. And linked to this idea of the divine light is the idea of fitrah and the idea of the innate aql. And for instance, al-Ghazālī says that the existence of God is something that is innate. It is something that is a priori. It is something that doesn't need a rational argument. The fitrah suffices to have a belief in the existence of God. But al-Ghazālī is not anti, of course, philosophical arguments or using a cosmological argument for the existence of God, right? Like Ibn Taymiyyah is, but al-Ghazālī, in a similar fashion as Ibn Taymiyyah, al-Ghazālī affirms the existence of God through fitrah. So inshallah, we'll also discuss the relationship between fitrah, the innate aql, and this divine light. So al-Ghazālī, he was a firebrand, right? He was engaged in quite a bit of polemics, and he was straddling two battles. On the one hand, he was dealing with the Batiniyah. On the other hand, he was dealing with the philosophers. The Batiniyah, the group of Ismaili Shi'is. So with the Batiniyah, al-Ghazālī was defending the place of reason and the veracity of reason. And with the philosophers, al-Ghazālī was defending the place of revelation and the limitations of reason. And so with the Batiniyah, and they're called Batiniyah because they reject the literal meaning of the Quran. They say that the Quran has an esoteric meaning, right? It has a Batini meaning, a hidden meaning, and that one can only know this hidden meaning or this esoteric meaning through an infallible imam. And this infallible imam is the religious authority, right? And so in this section of the course, I'm discussing certainty at the nexus between reason and religious authority. And so for the Batiniyah, they say, no, we can only know and we can only understand the esoteric meaning through an infallible imam. And they have this idea of ta'aleem, authoritative instruction. And this idea of authoritative instruction is that it is only to the infallible imam that we go to come to know the reality of things. And we do not affirm the veracity of reason. But, and so al-Ghazālī challenges them on this because they're critical of reason, right? They're skeptical. They are essentially skeptics. We can argue that they were the skeptics in the Islamic tradition, but they felt that the theologians and the philosophers, they're always arguing with one another. They never come to the same conclusion. They always differ with one another. So we cannot have any trust in reason, right? We need an infallible imam. So al-Ghazālī writes two books particularly addressed to the Batiniyah. One must remember there was the Fatimid dynasty and there was a theological as well as a military assault on the Abbasid and the Seljuk dynasty or duoky. And so al-Ghazālī writes the Fadaih al-Batiniyah والفضائل المستظهرية, the fadaih, the infamies of the Batiniyah and the virtues of the Mustadhiriyah. And in this text, al-Ghazālī, he deconstructs the philosophy of the Batiniyah. And what's interesting about him is he doesn't establish a straw man, right? He establishes a steel man of the argument, and he presents the argument and the philosophy in the most cogent manner. And he presents it better than they can present it themselves. And he systematically deconstructs the philosophy. And what's interesting about Ghazālī is very unique in how he argues. He doesn't just say, no, we don't believe in an infallible imam. He says, yes, of course, we should have an infallible imam. He says, I believe in an infallible imam, but our infallible imam is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we apply our reason to receive, to study the reports and come to know what he said, and we apply our ijtihad in matters that are out, that the Quran and the Ahadith do not speak to directly, right? And so he says, yes, we do need an infallible imam, and that is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he says, yes, of course, we do need ta'aleem. And he appropriates this concept of ta'aleem, and he says, yes, ta'aleem in the sense that we need authoritative instruction. I'm not against authoritative instruction, but we take authoritative instruction from a teacher that can teach us an infallible method. And what is that infallible method? He said that infallible method is philosophical logic. And then in the Fadaih, He gives a lengthy account or defense of reason, the place of reason, of philosophical logic, the veracity of philosophical logic, and how if you have reason and you now to apply syllogistic reasoning, then you do not need an infallible imam, but we need an infallible method. All right? Then he has another book called al-Qisṭas al-Mustaqim. In there again, he's defending the reason, not from reason itself, but he's using the Quran to defend reason, right? He's saying that the Quran itself uses reason. The Quran itself has syllogistical arguments. Syllogisms or syllogistical arguments, it's basically, you know, we have the main premise, the minor premise, the conclusion. That's a syllogism. It's essentially an argument, and this takes various forms. And al-Ghazālī says the Quran itself uses it, right? And so that endorses philosophical logic, or it endorses syllogistical reasoning. And he does this in a very unique way, and I think he's the first person that did it, and he makes mention of it. He says he's not the first person, though, to have theorized mantiq or logic. And so the Muqid is an excellent primer to mantiq or to logic. And he doesn't give credit to Aristotle, but he says, no, the philosophers took it from the prophets. And that's how they learned philosophical logic. Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, from the Quran, we can see that he was competent when it comes to arguments. We see his debate, his argument with Nimrod, for instance. And so al-Ghazālī shows that there is a balance between reason and revelation, that God uses reason, or God, the Quran is put like that. The Quran uses syllogistical reasoning, and so essentially it comes from the same source, right? And so he shows that balance between reason and revelation. And so here al-Ghazālī is defending reason, and on the other hand, when he's dealing with the philosophers, he's showing the limitations of reason, right? And what he's attempting to do when he's engaging with the philosophers is trying to humble the philosophers, right? Don't arrogate to yourself certainty on the basis of philosophical logic. Philosophy, or like reason, has certain limits. It has a particular ambit. So al-Ghazālī is attempting to defend revelation in this case. And he writes the Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. And so we'll be discussing this, inshallah. We'll be discussing in particular his skepticism of causality in his 17th chapter. And so the last part of the Tahafut focuses on natural science from the 17th chapter onwards. And what al-Ghazālī does here is he's trying to defend the possibility of miracles. And by extension of that, as an Ash'ari, is vindicating the omnipotence of God, right? That God is all-powerful, and if God so wishes, God can manifest a miracle, right? He can go against the cause of nature. And so the philosophers within their philosophy, when I talk about the philosophers, I'm talking about Ibn Sina and al-Farabi and their followers, they rejected miracles, right? They rejected miracles because they held the idea that causes and effects, there's a necessary connection between cause and effect, right? There's a necessary connection between cause and effect. That, for instance, cotton or fire has to burn cotton, and cotton has to be burnt by fire. It is within the capacity of fire to burn cotton, and necessarily so, right? Al-Ghazālī argues against this, right, using Ash'ari occasionalism. So al-Ghazālī uses an Ash'ari cosmology, where he argues that no, it's not necessary, right? Causes, effects do not follow necessarily from causes. This is just a psychological imprint upon your mind. It's just on the basis of experience. When you consume a morsel of bread, you are satiated, right? He says there's no necessary connection between bread and your satiation. There's no necessary connection that when you put fire and cotton in contact, that the fire will burn the cotton. There's no necessary connection there. That's just on the basis of your experience. So what's interesting here, Ghazali anticipates David Hume in this. And David Hume, of course, is very different. He's an atheist. So this argument has a double-edged sword. But what al-Ghazali is doing is defending the possibility that God can intervene in nature. And all that we see is that God creates causes and effects independently. God independently creates the cause and the effect, the cause and the effect, right? There's no necessary connection between the two. Therefore, what we see in nature is the adatullah or sunnatullah. It's the custom of Allah. It is the habit of Allah, right? And so God can go against his habit, right? But because it's the adatullah or the sunnatullah, one can still predict nature, but there are occasions or occurrences where there would be a miracle, right? Like Nabi Musa alayhi salam turning a staff into a snake, or Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam not being burnt by the fire. The philosophers rejected this. They rejected these miracles or the bodily resurrection, right? They rejected this because they felt that, no, the fire has to burn Abraham. So they read these things in a metaphorical manner, in a figurative manner, and on this basis, they undermine revelation. And by extension of this, they began to undermine the Sharia as well. And so what al-Ghazali is doing here is defending the place of revelation. He's saying you can only know cause and effect. It's only possible, right? He's saying that miracles, it is a possibility, but you cannot with reason argue for the impossibility of miracles. So al-Ghazali uses reason to argue for the possibility of miracles, right? And what's interesting is he uses an Ash'ari account or Ash'ari cosmology, and he also argues on their terms. He says, well, if you don't believe me, let me assume Aristotelian cosmology or Aristotelian physics. And he argues from that basis, he shows the possibility of miracles. It's like us saying today, let me use Newtonian mechanics or quantum mechanics to argue for the possibility of miracles. So al-Ghazali does that on their terms as well. And so al-Ghazali is showing that it is possible. The mind cannot show the impossibility of it. And it is to the Quran that we go to establish the certainty of the occurrence of those miracles. And so the Quran, the reason has a particular scope and revelation has a particular place. And in the content of revelation, there is content that the mind cannot access. And so that's al-Ghazali defending the place of revelation and the limited scope of reason and humbling the philosophers, right? And so what al-Ghazali is essentially doing is tahafut, is making room for the ihya, right? Al-Ghazali is defending the moral life of Islam, is defending the Sharia, essentially. So there's a maqsad to the tahafut. It's not just polemics, but what he's doing is defending the revelation, is defending the omnipotence of God, the place of miracles, revelation, and the Sharia and the moral life of Islam. And so essentially the tahafut is almost like a precursor to the ihya. And so al-Ghazali, he writes the Ihya after his spiritual crisis. And so al-Ghazali in the year, I'm sure many of you must have heard how much time do I have? Alhamdulillah, I still have some time. So al-Ghazali is famous for his spiritual crisis that he experiences in 1095. That's an important year, the year when he leaves Baghdad. So al-Ghazali, he says in his Munqidh, in the Deliverance of Error, he says that I knew that the truth is with one of four groups. Either the truth is with the philosophers, or the Batiniya, or with the Mutakallimin, or with the Sufis. He critiques the Batinis, he critiques the philosophers, he's sympathetic to the theologians, but he's critical of them at the same time. And then he says, and then he comes to the conclusion that it is with the Sufis that the truth truly lies. And he argues that, he says that I studied the works of the Sufis, and I came to realize that they are not people of statements, but they're people of states. They are not people of aqwal, but they're people of ahwal. And so al-Ghazālī, he says that learning came very easily to me. Right? He's a scholar, he's an intellectual, and he says learning came very easily to me. But I knew that I had to practice. I had to embrace the path of the Sufis. To truly know them, I have to walk the path. I cannot just study their books, right? And so he says that for several months, he was going back and forth and back and forth. And he says, I knew that I had to leave Baghdad. I had to leave my post. Now, al-Ghazālī, he was the principal of the Nizamiya College, right? That is like being the equivalent, that's the equivalent of being the rector of Harvard or Cambridge University. He was the principal of the Nizamiya College. He had thousands of students. He was always engaging in discussions and debates, and he was a celebrated scholar, right? And he says, I knew that this I did all for ego. It was all for name and fame. And I eventually had to leave this all, right? He said, if I continue on this path, then I will eventually end up in hellfire. So he says, I knew within myself that I was not doing it for the sake of Allah. And then he says, I became certain that I was on the brink of a crumbling bank and already on the verge of falling into the fire, unless I set about mending my ways, right? And so he says this, if every morning he woke up, he was committed, or every evening before he went to bed, he was committed to leaving Baghdad, leaving his post. But in the next morning, he would change his mind. This continued for 6 months. And then he says, eventually Allah made the decision for me. One day I went to class, I attempted to teach, but I couldn't satisfy the intellectual curiosity of my students. He says, I became tongue-tied. And because I became tongue-tied, I became melancholic. And then I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink. My body began to weaken. He went to a physician. The physician said, this is not a physiological ailment, but this is something of the heart. Right? I cannot help you. So al-Ghazālī eventually leaves. He leaves Baghdad. He leaves under the pretense of being, under the pretense of going on Hajj. He leaves and he travels throughout the Muslim world. And he writes the Ihya Ulumuddin, apparently. So he travels for 10 years, 10, 11 years. He travels throughout the Muslim world. And this is in 1095. And he writes his Ihya Ulumuddin in Damascus, in Syria. An interesting story. Al-Ghazālī, he wanted anonymity. He didn't want to be known, right? He didn't want to stir his ego. So he works as a janitor in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. And he's working as a janitor there. Nobody knows him. And people are teaching his books in the madrasa. And one day there's a group of scholars and there's this man that approaches these scholars and he had a question. And Al-Ghazālī was close by. He was cleaning, sweeping. And this man asked him this question, and none of them could answer his question. None of them, right? It was maybe a theological problem, or jurisprudential question of some sort. And al-Ghazālī felt the need to answer this man's question because he needed guidance and he wasn't getting the guidance that he was looking for. And then the man like laughs at Ghazālī, like, none of these scholars could answer my question, but you can, right? This janitor at the mosque. And the man goes back to these scholars and he says, like, the janitor told me this is the answer. And they were all surprised. They were all surprised. And eventually Al-Ghazālī had to leave the Umayyad Mosque. And then he goes on, he travels to Jerusalem, he travels to Makkah, to Medina, to Hebron, visits the tomb of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam. But that's a discussion for another day. And I'm hoping to discuss al-Ghazālī's biography and details about his life as well in the upcoming course. So, yeah, and I forgot to mention this, but prior to him leaving, his brother Ahmed al-Ghazālī, who was a famous Sufi scholar, he says that you've bestowed guidance on others, but are not well guided yourself. You've heard the homily, but you haven't heeded it. Oh, whetstone, how long will you sharpen the iron and not cut? Right? So al-Ghazālī writes the Ihya Ulumuddin in his time in Syria. He spends about 2 years in Syria. And the Ihya Ulumuddin is essentially, how much time do I have left? Okay, I have 5 minutes. I should wrap up. So al-Ghazālī, he writes the Ihya Ulumuddin, and in the opening he says that the Ihya is a work of, it's a science, the ilmu tariq al-akhirah. It's the science of the path to the hereafter. And he says this is a lost science, right? He says this is not an innovation, it's an excavation, right? The Khulafa al-Rashidin and the Sahaba, they knew the science. We've forgotten the science. He says, and he's critical of the jurists. He says you focus on the minutiae of the law. He's critical of the mutakallimin. He says you focus on polemics. He's critical of the grammarians. He says you're obsessed with nahu and sarf and the fine details. And he says, and none of you are preparing for the hereafter. And he says that is what matters. He says the mujahada is what matters. And he says that this science, the ilmu tariq al-akhirah, he says it comprises of ilmu al-mu'amala and ilmu al-mukashafa, the science of praxis and the science of divine unveiling. And he says the focus of the Ihya, I won't be discussing ilmu al-mukashafa, the divine unveiling, i.e. means he's not going to discuss the content of it, right? He does discuss it a little bit here and there, sporadically, but for the most part, he's focused on ilmu al-mu'amala. And of course, the Ihya Ulumuddin and the science of ilmu al-mu'amala, at its foundation, it is the Sharia. It's the Sharia, and in addition to that, it's ilmu al-akhlaq. It is the science of tasawwuf as we know it. It's about the purification of the heart. It is about polishing the soul. It is about removing the blameworthy qualities of the soul and imbibing and adorning and embellishing the heart with virtuous qualities and prophetic virtues. That's essentially ilmu al-mu'amala. And what's interesting, al-Ghazālī in the Ihya, he draws on other traditions. We see the influence of Platonic and Aristotelian thought as well. Al-Ghazālī creatively, of course, he comes from a position of authority, and he sees that, particularly in not so much the metaphysics, but the ethics or the ethical philosophy. You'd see it integrate that as frameworks because he deemed it to be universal. So, for instance, he talks about the tripartite division of the soul, or he talks about the 4 cardinal virtues of the soul, right? Wisdom, justice, temperance, courage, and so on. And so al-Ghazālī creatively integrates this into the Ihya Ulumuddin. And I'm hoping that in the forthcoming course for us to discuss the Ihya in quite some detail and to discuss the nature of al-Ghazālī's tasawwuf and what was his attitude towards mysticism, Sufism, and so on. But one of the main points that I do want to get across was that al-Ghazālī discusses this often in the Ihya and in many of his other works as well, right? He discusses that there are 2 paths to the knowledge of God, and he discusses which path is the path towards certainty, right? Is it the rational path? Is it the mystical path? Is it through philosophy and the rational sciences, or is it through Sufism? And there's a lengthy discussion, and al-Ghazālī has beautiful anecdotes and metaphors to explain and explain the difference between the two. And it's not They are not antagonistic to one another. They're not in tension. Many people read it in that manner, and he doesn't see it as mutually exclusive. And I discussed this in the conclusion to my book. I mentioned that al-Ghazālī harmonized the two disciplines, synthesizing the surety of the philosophical path with the greater luminosity and brilliance of the mystical path. So for al-Ghazālī, they were harmonized, right? And they do not contradict one another. But also he discusses this at length, that the rational path of philosophy will give you absolute certainty, but the mystical path gives you certainty as well, but also it is something that is experiential. It's something that is subjective, experiential. It's something that you can taste, right? It talks about dhawq. It's something that you can taste in the same way that the definitions and causes of good health, you may know the definitions and causes of good health, like a good scientist, or you could know what is good health. You could experience it, or you could know the properties of honey versus tasting honey. It's different. It's a different level of certainty. So al-Ghazālī speaks about the certainty of philosophy or the rational sciences, and then the certainty of Sufism, which he regards as superior because it's something that is experiential. And what's interesting to note as well, al-Ghazālī sees the philosophical path as a precursor to the Sufi path. So before you can engage in mujahada, before you work on yourself and you work on your heart, one has to study the rational sciences. You cannot become you cannot just go on the path and go into a state of seclusion and become a wandering Sufi. He says, prior to all of this, you have to study the rational sciences. And then he's critical, and I end off with this. It's one of my favorite quotes. He says this in The Alchemy of Happiness, 𝐁𝐚𝐸 𝐸. He says that, and so Ghazālī chastises those who dismiss the rational sciences on the basis of hearing such dismissals from their Sufi teachers. He says, this is as if a person who was not adept in alchemy were to go about saying alchemy is better than gold, and were to refuse gold when it was offered to him. Alchemy is better than gold, but alchemists are very rare, and so are real Sufis. He who has a mere smattering of Sufism is not superior to a learned man any more than he who has tried a few experiments in alchemy has grounds for despising a rich man. So al-Ghazālī is saying here that yes, Sufism is superior, but the thing is, real Sufis are rare. He says many Sufis, they walk the path for 10, 20 years and they attain nothing, right? And he says that it would be, he says like, yes, philosophy, he says that it's better for you to study the rational sciences first and attain something about the reality of the world, the haqaiq al-ashya, and to know something about God, to know the reality of God. And he says this is a more sure path. And he says once you have done that, then you can pursue the path of Sufism. But he says a man that is learned is superior to a man that is a superficial Sufi, essentially. So al-Ghazālī is very sober, and he's saying like, if someone brings to you gold, you're not going to reject that gold because alchemy is better. In the same way, if someone wants to teach you the rational sciences, mantiq or mustalah al-hadith or usul and so on, you do not reject that because you want to focus purely on your soul, right? So al-Ghazālī is saying that the philosophical sciences is a necessary prerequisite before engaging in Sufism. Shukran to everyone. I think I will end here. And I just thought I'd do this plug of the forthcoming course where we expand on much of what we discussed in today's webinar over 12 lectures, starting on the 23rd of June, al-Ghazālī's worldview, inshallah. We will be discussing al-Ghazālī's epistemology, focusing on doubt, on certainty, everything that we've discussed in today's lecture. Um, I wanted to share with you all the screen of the course itself online. Here we go. Am I sharing it? So here we go. And so this is just a quick overview of the course. And so this is the introduction to the course. We'll be discussing contextualizing Ghazālī, talking about his life, his works, introduction to Islamic epistemology, critical questions around him, the politics, the theological background. Here again, this is part of the second lecture, discussing skepticism, his hierarchy of certainty. We go on further to discuss his foundationalism, the existence of God, his methodological doubt. That's lecture 3. And then we talk about certainty, reason, and religious authority in lecture 4 and lecture 5. And we discuss the Batiniyah and al-Ghazālī's hermeneutics as well, right? I forgot I wanted to discuss that today in the webinar, but inshallah, we leave something to discuss in the upcoming course. And then in lecture 6, we'll be doing an introduction to Ash'ari theology and Abyssinian ontology and cosmology. We then go on to the 7th lecture, as well as the 8th lecture, where we talk about the Hafut and the philosophers and causality and so on, and the balance between reason and revelation. And then finally, we end off we discuss al-Ghazālī's second crisis and the quest for prophetic knowledge, the path to knowledge of God, the science of the path to the hereafter, and al-Ghazālī's Sufi ontology of oneness as the highest level of certainty, and the Quranic triad of certainty. And then we'll wrap up and we'll have a concluding lecture, recap, a discussion, some clarification, and so on. I think we'll leave it at that, and we can open up for some questions, inshallah. I see Brother Muhammad al-Gindi. He has a question. Perhaps he can unmute himself and share and speak into his mic. Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. It's very enlightening, and it's a wonderful book. So alhamdulillah for being here today, and once again thank you for that. And I do appreciate very much how you drew a lot of basically comparisons to modern day thinkers such as not modern day, but I mean modern thinkers such as Descartes and Hume. And I did like very much, I appreciate very much, because it has an impact on our lives, like how we contrast Descartes to طبعا of course Imam al-Ghazālī. I do have a question on that front, because you do seem to see the difference, and I was hoping maybe you can speak to more about that, the distinction in terms of doubt between Descartes,
yes,
who has a very I'll leave it up to you to say what he has. But the other thing I wanted to ask was basically he talked a lot about aql and of course the distinction between cause and effect, and I think you seem to imply that there is a major difference between the way that Muslims see cause and effect versus like how moderns see cause and effect, because you tie cause and effect to Adatullah, and even though Adatullah has been very alhamdulillah for our sanity, and also for our in many ways prosperity and health and everything, been very stable, but also it can break out of that stability. So how do you translate aql in that sense? What is aql? Is it the modern rational in the scientific hard science in the sense of biology and physics and modern mathematics and so on? Or do you have something else to add to that? And I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to that. I know these are big maybe questions, but if you can address them briefly. But thank you so much.
Shukran so much, Brother Muhammad. That's such a beautiful question. it requires a webinar on its own. But yes, that's an important discussion, and there's really been many articles written comparing Ghazali and Descartes and the methodological doubt. One point to mention is that for René Descartes, it's based on the light of reason, right? So he establishes his existence on the basis of reason. Whereas in the case of al-Ghazālī, he establishes his epistemic foundations. It is on the basis of a divine light, not the light of reason. And so for him, his foundationism is posited in God, in a divine source, whereas in the case of René Descartes, it is based on the light of reason. And I think Descartes, like when I look at the history of Western philosophy, I see Aristotle, Descartes, Immanuel Kant, and Descartes, he comes right after the Copernican revolution. And so Descartes is essentially challenging the scholastic tradition of Maimonides, St. Thomas Aquinas, uh, uh, um, and so on. And so because the Copernican revolution comes along, it challenges Aristotelian mechanics and the geocentric notion of the world. With that also came a rejection of Aristotelian philosophy and metaphysics and so on. So Descartes in that context. And so Descartes' conception of reason, his conception of the empirical is very much different. And so Enlightenment philosophy takes a different turn with René Descartes because, and if you look at the philosopher, Alistair McIntyre in his book After Virtue, he says that modern modern ethics, right? It's detached from a telos, or it's detached from our essences, right? Modern moral philosophy is on the basis of our preferences and on the basis of emotivism. And he says that is not entrenched in a rationalism. It's not rational, but he says that which is, when we talk about moral philosophy, what we deem to be rational is that which is connected to our essence, that's which is connected to our telos. And so he makes the argument for us to go back to virtue ethics. And what's interesting with al-Ghazālī is al-Ghazālī integrates the virtue ethics of Aristotle into the Islamic tradition, ilm al-akhlaq. But the shortcoming with McIntyre is we don't just have a virtue ethics, but we have the Sharia as well. And so within Ghazali and his Ihya Ulumuddin, we've seen the Sharia, but also a virtue ethics. And that I think the West can take from us. The West currently right now, McIntyre says the Enlightenment project has failed. The moral philosophy has failed. And he says, and so essentially, I feel that Islam has a practical philosophy, and so this is the relevance of Ghazali in that sense. And in terms of, just to answer your question on cause and effect and causality and the difference between then and now, today, when we read causality, we read it purely in a Newtonian, through the lens of Newtonian mechanics or quantum mechanics. And it comes through the philosophy of positivism. And positivism rejects metaphysics, it rejects ethics, it rejects aesthetics. And so it's a reductionistic science, whereas with Ghazali, as we saw, causality or cause and effect comes directly from God. And what we see in the empirical world, what we see in the physical world is it directly comes from God. And we read it as the adatullah. It's not, we don't see nature, we don't see the material in an independent sense, and it's not detached from a higher power. I hope that answered your question. Alhamdulillah. But shukran so much for it. We'll discuss it in more detail. I see there's a few other questions that students posted. How is Ghazali useful in our day-to-day activities? Yeah, so very much what I mentioned, the Ihya Ulumuddin. I think that is an excellent resource book by which one can live one's life. They say if the Quran and the Hadith tradition were to disappear from the face of the earth, then the Ihya Ulumuddin suffices for us to give us a way of life or a way of being. And that is another excellent book as well is Ghazali's Bidatul Hidayah. I would highly recommend that work if you're looking for something practical that can help on our day-to-day life. He discusses jurisprudence in there as well. He discusses the path of the Ihya. It's practical, but it's also theoretically dense. The Bidatul Hidayah is an excellent primer, and it's very practical. It'll tell you from the morning till the evening what you need to do. And so, Alhamdulillah is useful in that sense for our day-to-day activities. Let's see what other questions there are. So which impact did the understanding or the study of al-Ghazali's worldview have on your thinking and day-to-day life? And to who and why would you recommend this course? So, so this is, so one thing that sorry, 1 second. Okay. Noted, Brother Muniz. So I think al-Ghazali made me at least less dogmatic. And in my day-to-day thinking and my day-to-day outlook, I appreciate nuances. I see the complexity of things. And so al-Ghazali's epistemology, it's not simplistic, but there's a complexity to it, but things are complementary. For instance, like we don't see that tension between rationalism and empiricism in the Western tradition, but if you look at Ghazali's epistemology, he appreciates wahi, revelation, sense perception, reason, irfan and ilham, divine inspiration. And so in that sense, he has opened my mind and he allowed me to see the world in a different light, in a broader light. And of course, on a practical level, like I've just discussed, he has an impact in terms of my own daily practice as a Muslim. And he provides an excellent theoretical framework by which I can see the world and to understand my deen, to understand my faith. One philosopher that I particularly enjoy is Charles Taylor. He's written a book called The Secular Age. And he makes an interesting argument in there where he says, what does it mean to live in a secular age? He says what it means to live in a secular age is that everything is contested, that doubt is the default state. And he challenges the secularization thesis of Weber, right? Max Weber. He argues that with rationality and science and modernity, religion would be in decline. And with the rise of modernity and reason, there's a decline in religion, right? And Charles Taylor challenges that view. He said, no, that's not the case. It's just that because, in the 15th century, religion, to believe in God, was axiomatic, right? Everyone believed in God, but in the modern world, Taylor's saying the difference is it's not that there's a decline in religion, but he's saying just that the modern world is a world where everything is contested and skepticism and doubt is the default, and we have more options and we have the freedom to be apostates, is essentially saying, right? Because so I was myself personally trying to understand what does it mean to live in a secular age and what does it mean to live in a world where skepticism is the default state. But al-Ghazali allowed me to read the world in a manner where one can still be critical right? And skeptical, but still come from a position of faith. So al-Ghazālī was not a theological skeptic like we discussed. He still believed in God. He still believed in prophecy. He still believed in the end of times and the day of judgment and the ghaib. But with that as well, he was critical, he was rational, but he was coming from a position of faith. And so in that sense, I see that faith and reason are in balance, right? It's like the Said Nursi was Badiüzzaman Said Nursi. He was very Ghazalian. He's a 20th century Turkish scholar. He was very Ghazalian in his outlook. He says that faith and reason are like the wings of a bird, right? The two wings of a bird. If you on too much on the side of reason, you become an atheist. And if you're too much on the side of faith, you become a dogmatist. So the Islamic way of life, or the Islamic epistemology, or Ghazalian epistemology, balances faith and reason, or balances the wings, the two wings of a bird. Let's see, other questions. Is the understanding of al-Ghazālī's thinking work relevant for Muslims in this day and age? Yes, alhamdulillah. We just discussed that now. What is the relationship to the, okay, I don't understand that question. Will we learn how to identify a Sufi master to follow to understand who is genuine and who isn't genuine, and who isn't? Good question. Very important question. Al-Ghazālī discusses that in his here. He goes into detail. He talks about how do you identify a sheikh and he talks about how to identify a sheikh, what to do when one doesn't have a sheikh, right? And he discusses who is genuine, who isn't genuine. Al-Ghazālī is very sober in his Sufism as well. He's very critical of the Sufis. He's very critical of Abu Yazid al-Bistami, al-Hallaj. He says Tasawwuf is not about ecstatic utterances. He says Tasawwuf is about hard work. It's about mujahada. It's about working on one's heart. He's not anti them, but he's critical of them. But al-Ghazālī is very sober, and he gives some guidance in that regard as well. Yeah, let me see if there are further questions. To study the topics you mentioned, yes, we will. Are we going to read my book? I will perhaps, inshallah, recommend some. It will be based on a large portion of it will be based on my book, but we'll be looking at the primary text, right? So we will be looking at my book, inshallah, and mainly a selection of related texts from al-Ghazālī's corpus. Yes, we'll be mainly looking at al-Ghazālī's corpus and reading the primary works. Abdullah Harun, the poetry reading of Al-Maqasid YouTube channel on al-Ghazālī's poetry, a real tool for day-to-day and navigate through life. We use the Ghazālī children series to teach them and ourselves to also take the secularism out of our secular mind. Yes, yeah, there's an excellent series of Ghazālī for children. That's by Fons Vitae. A friend actually gifted a book for children on al-Ghazālī. It's interesting. One thing I love about Ghazālī, like Badiüzzaman Said Nursi, who I mentioned now, al-Ghazālī uses a lot of metaphors, a lot of anecdotes, there's a lot of stories. So he's very accessible, he's very palatable. And those stories and those anecdotes and metaphors, they have been turned into books for children. And so I think in terms of edification from a young age, tarbiyah, ta'deeb, I think Ghazālī has relevance there as well. And check out the publications of Fons Vitae. And I think Islamic Text Society as well. But I think, it's Fons Vitae. It's Fons Vitae. So shukran so much to everyone. Alhamdulillah. Thanks to you all for attending. I think we will leave it at that. And inshallah, I actually wanted to, I'll end off with this one paragraph, 2 sentences from a book, which I conclude with. I mention here that it was almost unanimous among scholars. It was almost unanimous among scholars that Ghazali was the reviver, the mujaddid of the religion in the 6th Islamic century. He continued to resonate among Muslims and impact later Islamic scholarship. Ghazali's thought is relevant today as it was yesterday. We live in a secular age with a plurality of beliefs where everything is contested and nothing escapes the scrutiny of doubt. Yet our world is not void of faith. We can draw inspiration from Ghazali to navigate our own world. For Ghazali, there was no antagonism between faith and reason, nor an impasse between philosophy and Sufism. His curious mind and skeptical spirit poked into every dark recess, made an assault on every problem, plunged into every abyss, and scrutinized the creed of every sect. And yet, he held firm onto the rope of faith and ventured to consistently seek higher levels of certainty. Shukran to everyone for attending. Shukran to Al-Balagh Academy for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.